everybody, welcome to the horror track at Dragoncon. We're here to talk about Anne Rice. The official title of the panel is Return of the Queen. As you guys, I'm sure, know, a little bit earlier in the year, there was an announcement that Anne Rice was going to make an announcement about her latest book, and I'm sure we all know that the announcement was that the title of the new book is Prince Lestat. It'll be coming out in October, and it's a return to the Vampire Chronicles. And because of that, we're gathered together to talk about all things Anne Rice. We're not just going to talk about the vampire books. We're going to talk about a little bit of everything. Our favorites up here and your favorites out there. We'll take a lot of questions because we like to do things in dialogue fashion. That means we don't want to hear ourselves talk for an hour. But anyway, let's start off by introducing ourselves. I'm Clay Gilbert. I've been a member of the Horror Track staff since before it was the Horror Track staff. It used to be the Dark Fantasy staff. I've been on the track for 6 years. Also, I write science fiction and horror novels. This is my latest book. I'm published by PDMI Publishing. And as far as my vampire qualifications, I've written a vampire novel called Dark Road to Paradise. I'm also a lifelong Anne Rice fan. I started way back when Interview was published originally, and I followed her career the whole time. She was a big influence on me.
I'm Corvus Nocturnum. I also write under E.R. Vernor recently. My limited expertise on the vampire is Allure of the Vampire, or Sexual Attraction to the Undead, and a book coming out through Shipper Publishing next spring called Evolution of the Vampire from Myth to Modern Day. I had the push from Michelle here to put out the first one, and I was very glad that I did.
Put out. That sounds good. Okay, never mind. It's late. There's a lot of caffeine, and I apologize.
So, you know, I owe a lot to this woman. So, with no further ado.
I'm Michelle Belanger. Most people who recognize me visually have probably seen me either on Paranormal State or on pretty much every vampire documentary the History Channel airs and re-airs ever. My books on vampires include Sacred Hunger, Vampires in Their Own Words, the Vampire Ritual Book, and the Psychic Vampire Codex. My main focus and thrust with vampires has been nonfiction, the vampire and folklore fiction, but also in pop culture, and how it's kind of taken on a life of its own as an archetype. And I am also a fiction writer, so we will see a series launch next year. Yay. Okay. And I will try not to be like horribly blue and inappropriate. But no guarantees.
It's 10 o'clock.
Yeah, it's 10 o'clock, no guarantees. And we're talking about Anne Rice, so really.
Exactly. Transgression, transgressiveness, and all variants thereof are welcome. Why don't we talk a little bit about, first of all, how we got introduced to Anne Rice, our perspectives on Anne's fiction. For me, it was, like I said before, Interview with the Vampire. I've read pretty much everything that Anne's written. I definitely am a fan of the vampire stuff first and foremost. Not so much Mayfair Witches stuff. I loved Servant of the Bones, and I wish she'd written more of those. But I'm glad to see that Lestat's coming back. That's all I'll say about that.
I'd have to say that although I've always been, you know, big into fiction reading, there was a period in my life where I was just drifting from one job to another, and I kind of lost touch with that creative side of myself until I worked at the movie theater. And I happened to be going through the aisles, and Interview with the Vampire was playing in Boulder, Colorado, where I was living, and that re-sparked my interest in the vampire and in fiction in general. And, you know, that later spurred me into being a writer. So yeah, it was around 1994 when it finally came to a head, and I started reading her entire chronicles.
I have had a passion for the vampire and fiction folklore, in fact, since elementary school, really early elementary school. I'm not quite sure what sparked it to begin with. I can tell you vividly my first introduction to Anne Rice. I was a Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough fan, still am, and count myself a friend as well. So I'd read the Saint Germain series and had chewed through pretty much everything that was out and was looking for something else to read. And I picked up Interview with the Vampire. And while it no longer shows, I was a very, very sheltered, raised Catholic girl. And so I was reading an review, and there's points where I'm like, oh, my stars and garters, I think I need to go to confession. I think this is gay erotica. It didn't stop me from finishing the book.
I too started off with Quinn's books. Certainly count myself a fan and a friend of Quinn as well. And other than Saint Germain, Lestat and Louis were the first two really human vampires that I came in contact with. And I'm one of those people that I like my vampires to be vampires. I like my vampires to drink blood and to have difficulties with sunlight. But I like complicated monsters.
Difficulties above and beyond sparkling.
Exactly. Exactly. We're going to point that out. No, we're going to leave the sparkling, but Michelle had to do it.
Yeah, sorry. No offense to anybody, but just doesn't
Rabble
bad taste
rouser.
in my mouth. Yeah, and now we're done.
I like my monsters complicated though, and I like a little touch of the human in my immortal, and that's what Quinn brings to her stuff, and Anne brings to her stuff as well. So I welcomed Interview with the Vampire when I first read it.
I regret I haven't had the pleasure of reading a lot of Chelsea's work.
Absolutely should.
I've done a cursory, research on her and the general gist of her work in order to write about it academically. But before Anne Rice, the only exposure I had to vampires really was Stoker's, and it touched a chord in me so much that when I was around 10 years old, 2 years later after reading it, I had to give an oral book report, and I was being lazy at the time. I wasn't ambitious back then, and I had to stand up and give a speech. And I picked Stoker's Dracula, and I winged the whole thing out of memory, got an A on it, and then I admitted 2 years later to the lit teacher that I bullshitted my way through it, and he said, well, you did a fine job.
So did Stoker. I love the book, but so did Stoker.
Yeah.
I think he bullshitted his way through it too.
It's not a book that would hold up in the publishing industry currently.
No, the whole epistolary thing has kind of gone
But
the way.
certainly the things that the archetypes he hit on, I think, are bigger than any of the failings of his prose.
Right.
I think if we have to be honest about it, Stoker had a huge impact on vampires, but Chelsea and Anne Rice were far more prominent in our lifetime. But we kind of owe that type of archetype to Lord Byron more than anything.
I could do an entire panel on Byron, but I think actually to take the whole Byronic vampire, and one of the reasons that Anne Rice had the impact that she did and continues to have the impact that she did, but at the time in the 70s when the Vampire Lestat, she took two very, very compelling archetypes. The vampire, and anybody who was her age group had cut their teeth with Barnabas Collins as the first humanized vampire. Yeah, I know, pun fully intended. And the rock star. And she married those two very compelling tropes. So you have this human monster who also has no problem putting himself out there. And that really harkens back to Byron, because he was kind of like the first really pop celebrity.
He definitely was. I mean, he was certainly a literary rock star, and I would go so far as to say he relished the role.
Oh yeah, he absolutely did.
Just the way that Lestat does in the book.
Yeah, so there's nods there. I mean, the only other historical figure you could arguably make a case for being that kind of a pop culture hero would be Farinelli, the Castrato.
Right.
But since probably everybody's like, who?
Right, Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
Yeah, Oscar Wilde.
Wilde is after Byron. Wilde is the end of the 1800s. Byron was born in 1788, died in 1824.
You stand corrected?
Yeah. Anyway, and so we take this already compelling, charismatic figure. You see echoes of it with Stoker's Dracula. He's a monster. I mean, Dracula, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about him being a monster, and yet he's still a sexy monster. There's still that domineering, that charismatic presence where he's able to draw people in. Rice takes that and then just goes balls to the wall with it.
She does, definitely.
And I would compare, how many people are familiar with Laurel K. Hamilton's work with vampires? So Laurel has managed to really push the envelope of what is accepted in a New York Times best-selling book that is not explicitly erotica, and did the same thing for her time period. I mean, yeah.
Was she the first to take the vampire like really public and really take the political side of vampires over there, for instance?
She's not necessarily the first, but I think that she is the first that really hit it on a very, very big scale. Quinn, because her stuff is historical romance and it's a little heady, it's very intellectual, she did not have the same kind of popular appeal. But marrying it specifically to that rock star image, I think is what gave him what we call in the publishing industry the hook. And allowed people to go, wow, you know what, this is David Bowie, this is Sting, these are people who live larger than life and really grab people, really suck them into their story.
And even before the second book, when we were still getting Lestat filtered through the unreliable narrator of Louis, she still grabbed the audience with a different portrayal of vampires. It still wasn't quite okay. It still wasn't quite. There was a dimension of moral conflict there, and I think that's an important part of Anne's appeal for me, is that there's a dimension of moral conflict in not Lestat. He relishes his role, but Louis and some of the other vampires in her world are a little bit more in the gray area, more morally speaking. They're not necessarily comfortable with what they are, but it's what they are.
Well, she lets it be, and I'll let you talk in a second.
Sure.
She lets it be a continuum, that like what you would expect in humanity. You've got people who are just like, you know what, this is awesome sauce. I mean, Lestat might not be happy about it initially.
Right.
And then you've got the conflicted Louis on the other side, and then everything else in between.
You do, certainly.
I honestly think that Reich's work, almost all of her stuff, but especially the Vampire Chronicles and the earlier part of the saga, anything in fiction has a chord to strike with the audience. If you paint the characters, no matter how fantastic or supernatural, you make them underneath that human. Because we can all identify with any one of those characters that she portrays with someone you know, whether you truly know them or you just know of them, that type. And I think it's more powerful as readers. You know, the best films and fiction have that aspect.
That's a particular